you so much, listeners, for joining us again. We are back for the How Science Can Strengthen the Faith of Your Church conference. My name is Elaine Howard Eklund, and I am a professor of sociology and director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. And I'm also the author of Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear. This session is going to be exploring the value of curiosity, in particular through ministry to youth and young adults is the focus of our session now. I am joined by two wonderful people who I think are so equipped to help us struggle with some of these issues. Dr. Greg Cootsona, I should say the Reverend Dr. Greg Cootsona, is a lecturer in religious studies and humanities at Chico State University. I am also joined by the Reverend Dr. Gus Reyes, who is director of the Christian Life Commission for Texas Baptists. Throughout our sessions, we have several people who are Reverend Doctor, so I'm feeling a little bit humbled by only one title after my name. I have a few questions that people ask me, and I would like to pose to you. And listeners, if you could be thinking of questions that you have while these gentlemen are speaking, and go ahead and put those in the question and answer button or the menu on your webinar. And please put your organization, your nation. We have people from many different nations watching us, which is wonderful and such a privilege. So let us get started. So the first question is, how could congregations better nurture curious exploration of science among youth and young adults? How could congregations better nurture curious exploration of science among youth and young adults? Greg, why don't you get started?
Sure. Well, one of the things that that I bring to that question is the years that I've had in caring for youth and more young adults, first in New York City and then here in Chico, California, north of Sacramento. And in meeting up with people who are Christians in congregations, there's been a variety of ways that people have responded to science and faith. Sometimes, honestly, it is apathy, but most of the time it's this really deep interest, Elaine, that you have identified, that people want to bring these two things together, especially people of faith. And so in the work that I've been about in the ministry, let's say, we'll talk just about that as a pastor, one of the things that really connects for people is the idea of wonder and awe. You know, the idea that there's this amazing universe, that amazing world that God has created that is literally wonderful, right? It's filled with wonder. And that wonder brings us into the position of praise and gratitude as a religious person, but almost anybody can find this sense of awe and transcendence. I mean, even Richard Dawkins talks about that as part of science, that there's a sense of awe and wonder. So to me, that connects really directly with curiosity, that as you see the wonder of the natural world around us, you can find that you're just more and more curious to expose yourself really to more of it. I'll just close with one last little anecdote. There was a PhD student that I got to talk to through one of the grant programs I've done, PhD student at NYU who had grown up in Puerto Rico. And he told me that his interest in science began by studying bugs in the cracks of the sidewalk. I just love that. You know, like that's how it started for him. So I think that curiosity is so important to nurture, both as a faith leader, but also for our the people in the pews who might be drawn into science or technology.
Yeah. Pastor Gus, I know you have done so much in this area through your work, and you're really passionate about education, particularly for Hispanic youth. And just I wonder what your thought is in terms of how could congregations better nurture curious exploration of science among youth.
Thank you for the question. I would say that part of my answer comes from a dialogue with Dr. Richard Ross, who's a professor at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Richard and I spent many decades working with youth, teenagers, young adults together, but whether it be across the country or in churches, et cetera. And one of the things we've concluded is if you want to get to youth and young leaders, you have to start first with their parents.
Mm-hmm.
If there is not parent involvement, if parents aren't comfortable with a curiosity, then it just makes it a barrier to overcome when you deal with youth and youth leaders, because you have to remember, in most churches, we're going to get teenagers and young leaders on Sunday morning for an hour, maybe hour, couple hours, Wednesday night for another hour. That's 3 hours. But they're engaged to some degree with their parents almost 24/7, Monday through Saturday. So we kind of feel like, the parents are a big key to the answer. So we have to think through, how are our parents doing when it comes to curiosity? And so we have some suggestions that we give to students, that we give to parents and youth leaders. And one of those suggestions is to create a free space where it can be an environment where, the next hour after dinner or on the couch or in Sunday school or in Bible study or whatever, the next hour or the next 30 minutes, you get to ask any question that you want to ask on anything. In fact, we might even create a tough questions chart. So you don't even have to be in the classroom. You can come and say, I'm going to write down this question, and we can recognize, hey, this is a tough question, and we're going to give attention to this. And so I think you have to create a space at the home and at the church and in Bible studies and youth gatherings and young gatherings to be able to ask questions, tough questions, and not dismiss them, but actually put them down and record them and say, we're going to, and then we want to find solutions, and then we want to make those solutions shareable. We want parents, senior adults, everybody in the church to know, hey, we found a solution. We have an answer for a tough question, and just make it part of the environment, part of the culture of the church. I just think that opens up the door for so many. And then, you're going to have some people who push back on these questions, right? And to that, I say, let's look at the life of Jesus. Jesus asked tough questions. In fact, in most of the lessons he gave us, he asked questions. One of the toughest questions Jesus asked was, can this cup be lifted from me? And so if Jesus is willing to ask God a question, a tough question, then we should feel good about asking questions and challenging ourselves to be free and to welcome difficult questions, because we know there's solutions, and we can be confident that with God's help, with help from science and so many other resources, we can find solutions, and then we can share.
That's just wonderful. That's just wonderful. For those of you who are just joining us, again, this is a session about curiosity, particularly nurturing curiosity for youth and young adults. And I'm joined by Reverend Dr. Greg Cootsona from Chico State University, and Reverend Dr. Gus Reyes, who's director of the Christian Life Commission for Texas Baptist. And you can find more from both of their extensive bios and work in this relevant area in your chat menu.
Elaine, can I add one thing to what Dr. Reyes said? Because I think it's so important that I just love that emphasis on asking questions as part of curiosity. When I did a grant project on students and emerging adults in science, I found through the research that I've uncovered that the secret sauce for a positive view of faith and science were people early on given the opportunity to ask questions and to pursue their questions. And I know your research has also shown that kind of importance. And we just have to create faith communities and other places where we gather as people of faith, where questions are part of faith. There's that old version of faith with Anselm, faith seeking understanding. The word is querens, from which we get the word question. It's almost faith questioning for understanding's sake. And I just love that. So kind of, Dr. Reyes, I'm just sort of saying an amen to that. That's a wonderful emphasis.
I would also add that, low-lying fruit for the family of faith is to pursue science through a faith lens, focusing on how God has done what he has done. So we believe what God has done. So let's use science and all that we have available through science to discover, how did God do this? What mechanisms did he use? And so I just think it adds fuel to the opportunity to be involved in a search.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. So we've talked some about how congregations can better nurture curious exploration of science among youth and young adults. So my next question is, how could congregations better nurture curious exploration of faith for youth and young adults? Of course, all three of us know many stories of youth who've left their faith communities because they feel like their questions were not answered or not even dealt with. Is there ways that our faith leaders who are listening, our youth pastors who are listening, family members who have youth right now can help better nurture curious exploration of faith? Pastor Gus, why don't you start off?
I was just waiting.
I forgot my teacher role. I need to call on you. I need to get back in that mode. It's a little bit funny online, isn't it? Okay.
I want to reference what Dr. Cootsona said earlier. It really comes back to the questions. I think helping students, helping people at church with great questions and affirming them, like, well, that's a great question, and having an environment where we affirm great questions coming forward, and where we as teachers and pastors, use questions to promote reflection, to encourage people to go search it out. This week, here's question of the week, go check out your resources, et cetera. Let's come back and then let's have a dialogue about what you discovered. And here's one thing I wanted to lift it up. Again, going back to Jesus. Jesus faced someone who a lot of us have called the doubter, Thomas. And when he first dealt with Thomas, he didn't come in criticizing him. That wasn't the posture at all. He saw Thomas and he said, come touch my hand. He invited him into searching out the facts and to finding his solution, that what he needed. And he helped him have a pathway to faith, to strengthen his faith. And we know from that Thomas was a major faith leader thereafter. I just think that's a model for us. Instead of challenging students or demeaning people who have questions or being frightened or fearful about doubt, we need to help people get to the facts about their faith, and help them to establish a path that helps them to grow in their faith. And so I think that's a pretty important piece. Searching out facts and letting facts be a way that helps us strengthen our faith journey.
That's really good. And the relationship between doubt and curiosity is such an interesting one. I touched on that just a little bit in why science and faith need each other. And I'm really glad that you brought that up. I think that's really important. Yeah, Greg, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I do. Just because this is so deeply meaningful for me, this being the way that we describe faith as faith leaders. And I'll speak from the Christian context particularly. So this should sound like the setup for a joke. I went to UC Berkeley and became a Christian. Not the way it usually goes, right? And in that early part of my faith formation as a Christian, I went to First Presbyterian Church at Berkeley, where Mark Laberton was our college pastor and where Earl Palmer was our head of staff, senior pastor. And I'm going to hope I can get through this without tears in my eyes, because this is such an important insight for me. Earl had this parable, he said, that started out with a statement: the Christian faith is not fragile. In fact, the Christian faith grows under the kind of under non-ideal growing conditions. It grows best when it's stressed. And he was talking through the book of Philippians chapter 1, where Paul says, hey, I'm in prisons, I've been in that prison, what do I care that the gospel is preached? That's the important thing. And Earl had this parable, he said, remember in Mary Poppins, when that phony general shoots off the cannon in the afternoon, and everybody runs to their shelves and holds up their fragile pottery and so on, so it won't fall off their shelves. And he says, that's how sometimes people of faith treat their faith, like it's fragile. Like once there's some explosion, some challenge comes to faith, you got to hold the pot up, because it's going to fall off the shelf. And Earl said, but the gospel is not fragile. And I'll never forget that, because what he gave me and what Mark Laberton gave me as my pastor in college was this tremendous sense that if we have confidence in what our faith is secured to, then we have freedom to explore. We have freedom to ask questions. And we have freedom to allow those questions not always to be, well, sometimes to be ongoing questions. The longer I've been a Christian, the longer those questions sometimes have an arc of being responded to. But sometimes it's just making sure we create a space in which, we have confidence in this faith we have in God. And because of that, we don't have to answer every question. We can allow those questions to be explored. So I think my answer is what my own experience was with Mark and with Earl was the confidence in the faith that I was taught was one of it is durable. It does better, in fact, when it's challenged, because that demonstrates that it's not fragile. And I think that's what I have hoped to be as a faith leader for other people.
Oh, that's beautiful, Greg. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's hard to move on from there, you two. One of the things that we want in the How Science Can Strengthen the Faith of Your Church conference is for people to leave with practical tools. And I wonder if you two as leaders, and again, we're joined by Dr. Greg Cootsona and Dr. Gus Reyes talking about curiosity right now. How you two as leaders might talk about best practices or tools for seeing faith communities nurture curiosity among children and young adults. So what are very practical helps you might have for people, resources, best practices for people who are wanting their faith communities to do more to nurture curiosity among children and young adults?
I'll go first just to avoid Elaine having to be teacher again, as you called yourself. I would just start with, your book is fantastic. I think your other books, which I've very subtly displayed behind me here, are the kinds of things that really give the sort of intellectual heft to understanding faith and science. And the recent book of Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, I think is the kind of resource that can really help. So there are really important places where resources are a practical tool. And I'll get back to that at the end of this answer. I think in addition, we've already touched on that really critical role that faith leaders can play in understanding faith and science. And Jonathan Hill, whom I think you're gonna have later on in this conference, right? Has demonstrated that it's actually the pastor more than the professor that helps Christians understand that faith and science can connect with one another. Yeah, and what's really funny was when I made my transition from being a pastor to teaching as an academic, I read that, which was it was like the wrong timing. I should have read it before I left, I don't know. So it's really important what pastors say, and pastors can open the door, and I hope they do it with humility to say we don't have the answers necessarily, but we can explore the questions. I would go back to mentoring is incredibly important. So one of the things, again, speaking from the faith community as a Christian, I think that we, in all kinds of different ways that we're leaders, and not just pastors, but even me as now an academic leader as a Christian, we want to be nurturing science and technology as Christian vocations. So that's not illegitimate. There's that statistic from Barna that 52% of youth group kids will go into a science or technology related field, but that only 1% of youth groups one time a year address science and faith. Now, if that's, let's just use those as illustrative comments, or insights. We have to be engaging topics that youth and young adults care about. And I wrote down a few talking points that I wanted to make sure I addressed. And one of those was just to say, as I've ministered to, if I may say, hundreds of 20-somethings, college students, post-college students, I've found that faith and science is a critical issue. It's not the only issue, but it's something we have to deal with in a very positive way as faith leaders. So engaging in those topics is incredibly important. I just want to close and say, and I do have a longer list of resources, website, newsletter, et cetera, through the organization that I co-direct with Drew Rick Miller called Science for the Church, at scienceforthechurch.org. And that we have a lot more resources. And I'm going to say this, if anybody wants to email me at greg@cootsona.net, greg@cootsona.net, I'd be happy to answer questions on the resource side of how this conversation can be robust and really healthy for
that's fantastic. And we're, of course, folks who are listening, putting those up in our chat window as well. So both Greg's personal email address, he is I know from personal experience, just a fount of resources in this area, and also the ministry that he co-directs with Drew Rick Miller, Science for the Church. Dr. Reyes, Gus, are there any things that you want to add? Very practical resources. You already are so deeply practical, but anything else you
I
wanted
do
to
want to
add?
give you maybe 5 best practices
Oh,
that
great.
discovered along the way, and then I want to give you an example of a church that's actually doing these things, and I'll give you their information, just a practical example. But some of this is addressed to, like Greg said, the pastors, faith leaders, and again, we cannot ignore the importance of parents and the role they play in this, because they can help us, or they can redirect. Them being godly parents and pursuing that position and that posture makes all the difference in the world. And so, Greg mentioned there's a lot of kids going into science, et cetera. The number is about 50% of kids leave church when they go to college. And so maybe we did a better job in helping them to deal with these doubts and questions early on. That may not be the case, but best practice number 1, and it's just a statement, but how we respond to their questions on our face and our attitude says more to them than what we say. And so I think that comes from the heart, that comes from the mind, so I think we all have to make a decision to share in their curiosity, to strengthen our own sense of curiosity. In fact, we should all sign up to become lifelong learners. Because if we're all learning, then we come to the classroom, we come to church, we come to the car, we come to Sunday school, and we go home, we say, I learned something today, or I learned something this week, and let me share that with you. Because once you learn something, you want to share with people, with others in your family. And so let's just affirm the idea of becoming lifelong learners. And then how we respond to them, we should say things like, let's work through this together. We're not going to answer all of this today, and that's okay. Let's create that space where we don't have to answer all the questions in the moment, right? But you can say things like, it's okay not to have a complete answer, but we're going to work on this together and practice. I think parents and adults have to practice saying that so they can actually believe it and then be true. If you say, we're going to work this out, go work it out, go find the answers and solutions and talk to people like Greg and yourself and others and other pastors who've already traveled these roads and these journeys. You may think you're the only one that's trying to answer this question for your child or your teenager, but believe me, others have already asked and answered, and their faith have grown and they've done well, and that's available too. So seek help. The other thing is, I would say number 4 is have intentional conversations.
Yes.
We get caught up with Facebook and music on, we're taxis. When you're a parent, you're a taxi, you're taking to soccer, you're taking to school, you're a taxi, right? Well, use those taxi trips to ask questions and have reflective questions. I mean, we tell parents, don't ever ask your son or daughter a question that can be answered with yes or no, because that's how they'll answer. They'll just say yes or no, and that's the end of the conversation. So ask a question that starts with the word what, or where, when, or how, but don't be judgmental, but ask them questions that cause them to reflect and to think about their answer. And then listen, like I think Greg mentioned earlier, you need to listen. Listening is a big part of that. And then I think we need to remember that children are concrete thinkers. And so we're going to give an answer. We're going to help them find a solution. But as they evolve, as they grow toward adulthood, those questions are going to resurface. And so we need to help them resurface and to help them dig deeper this time, because now they're a 4th grader, now they're a 6th grader, now they're an 8th grader, and we've got to go back. And so we have to learn that just because we answered a question, it's not really over. We're not finished. It's just part A of that question that's been solved and answered. Let me tell you about one church. It's just this one, and it's a very small church in the Valley of Texas. It's called Olmedo Community Church. The pastor is a dear friend, Robert Cepeda. He and his wife started the church. Every Wednesday, they have something called Science Explorers for the kids. In other words, they deal with science head on. It's not accidental. It's not just something that comes up occasionally. This is every Wednesday. They talk about science concepts and they make biblical connections with these science concepts. And so during COVID-19, they've had to do this through Facebook and through Zoom, et cetera. But, the teacher, Diane Cepeda, the wife, and by the way, these are grades 3 through 12. So they've got all kinds of ages watching and participating. But they'll do a science demonstration, and then they'll ask the children to replicate it. And as the children have difficulties, then they'll review math, they'll review reading. They have all kinds of elements that they give attention to so that they can help the kids. But I mean, they're dealing with life science, plants, animals, planting, earth science, rocks, soil, studies about volcanoes, weather force, motion, lunar cycles. And Diane says, and it's so much fun. Wait a minute. Who said church was supposed to be fun? Well, okay then, if that's the case, if we can have fun with these things, praise God. Why can't church be fun? And if church is fun when you're 3 to 12 years old, why can't it be fun when you're a youth and when you're a youth leader? And so I think we need to bring fun back into church, and deal with these things head on and ask questions and reflect, and then we can all grow through it. So I'm going to put Diane's information, the name of the church down so y'all can have that available. But they're very intentional. This is not accidental. They believe they want their children to become the best ambassadors for Christ that they can become. And so they realize that science is part of that. Academics is part of that. So why not have fun doing it and learning about God's word at the same time?
Oh, that's such a great example. And of course, they're showing too that science can be a calling, right? That there's that church is the place where you might learn about science and be fostered in science. That's so redemptive. That's really a neat example. Good for them. Of course, we're all thinking right now about COVID-19, its social and collateral impacts, and about the problems of systemic racism in our society. We're all thinking about that right now. Have you seen curiosity displayed in our modern times, either in the faith community or the scientific community during this time?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Greg. I'll go ahead. The answer is yes, in so many different ways. There's all kinds of curiosity and testing going on. That whole scientific process, where you have a theory and you test something out, see if it works. If it doesn't, you try again, etc. Well, here's the whole thing. We used to go to church on Sundays at a building. COVID-19 hits, and pastors, teachers, youth ministers, children's ministers, everybody's trying to figure out how do we become the presence of Christ in our communities, to our church community during COVID-19. So all kinds of testing is going on with Zoom, with Facebook. How do you get Sunday school classes together and engage? How do you teach sermons that make a difference while you're live streaming? How do you get people to participate? And just like we're doing a chat here, you have questions, et cetera, this chat piece. Well, churches are trying to figure that out as well. They're trying to figure out best practices so they can share with other churches on how to get Zoom up and running and having a Zoom message on Sunday morning. And by the way, one church that has 225 people that attend on Sundays regularly in their Zoom and live streaming are seeing something like 2,000 people come and watch. I know another church. Churches are multiply their normal attendance by 10 or 15 or 20, and you'll see that many people that are coming to watch God's word and to hear and listen. So there is a curiosity about COVID-19, what's going on in our world with all the different challenges we face, and what are faith solutions, because people are searching, and it's a wonderful time for preachers and ministers to speak to this issue of, now that you're searching, you have questions about what's going on. The stock market's going berserk today. How does all this relate to how we live? So they're looking for best practices and ways that they can communicate a Christian message. And by the way, we're trying to do this in Spanish too. So add the English and the Spanish, and then another thing. Some churches are just having drive-in churches. They're experimenting with how do you get on a trailer or get the music fans outside, and then people can just drive in and they're telling people, if you want to say amen, honk your horn, and you hear a bunch of horns honking. They're experimenting, and so it's awakened a kind of a new curiosity going forward. And by the way, pastors have used one word when I talk to them consistently, that is the word humility.
Yes.
This is a humbling experience. I didn't know anything about Zoom or drive-in parking or all these kinds. I didn't know anything about this. COVID-19 is very humbling. I've had to go find a bunch of 7th graders to help me know how to do this, who have no theological training, but they know Zoom and they know technology. So, praise the Lord for 7th graders, right? But we've had to become very creative and very curious about how to deliver God's message during a chaotic time like COVID-19. So I think there's a lot going on in this space.
Greg, I wonder if you wanted to add anything before we go. I see we have quite a few questions coming in, so we'll turn to those in a moment. But Greg, did you want to add anything about this current moment and curiosity in this current moment?
Well, I mean, I think Pastor Gus said it so well. So I will only add that I believe that the difference between approaching faith with curiosity and approaching it as a without curiosity is such a key element of how we respond to COVID and to racism in our country, and whether we want to learn about how A, not to be a racist, and B, how to respond and love our neighbor in a COVID-19 world. So I guess I would make the exhortation: let's work in our churches and whatever faith communities or religious communities we're in to create that kind of curiosity, because it's absolutely essential right now.
That's right. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to our question and answer, and do listeners feel free to put questions there if you have questions, and we love to know your organization or your nation if you'd like to put that. So one questioner says, Dr. Reyes said you need to start with the parents. How do you do that, especially if the parents aren't particularly knowledgeable or curious about science?
Right. I think that's a big opportunity for us. By the way, thank you for that question. It's a great question. You know, one of the things I can tell you about dads is dads do better when they see other dads doing something. So there are dads who are practicing this, they're being intentional, that are asking questions to their children. I mean, preschoolers and elementary school. And so those guys have a story to tell. Help them tell their story. Let these parents who we're talking about, who may not be that interested, et cetera, let them hear this dad's story. And so dads have a tendency of, if I hear another guy do it, well, then that means I can do it. I mean, I can do it. You know, we're competitive, right? So I could try that with my son, or I could try that with my daughter. And so if you help the dad of the home do it, the mom will, boy, she'd love that, to see dad engage his kids, you know, better. But you give him tips and you give him suggestions and you help them. Again, this is where a pastor is very helpful, because he's a dad most of the times and he can share how he's engaging his children. But if we hear stories, I think we need to go back to the story. We hear stories of how people are being blessed by this engagement and being curious with their children. I think that just helps encourage so many others to participate as well. And it gives us
that's
to try
so fantastic. And I know I'm hearkening back to what you said a few minutes ago, that you don't always need to know the answer, but it's our responsibility to give the space for kids to ask hard questions and to have a real posture of reception to those questions. That's really fantastic. Here's another question for us. This is from a professor from Wheaton College in Illinois. How can we help foster curiosity among children and youth in underprivileged neighborhoods, particularly when they may have parents who are working multiple jobs, have just to make ends meet, and have very little time?
I'll answer that, but if Pastor Gus wants to too, that's fine. I would say that, you know, one of the things that I have been really convicted by as a person who's been involved in this religion and science conversation and dialogue for the past 25 years or so is how often it does skew and map onto privileged communities, et cetera. And I think we need to, in this conversation, just demonstrate ways that it doesn't have to be a privileged exploration. Curiosity is not reserved for people of privilege, you know. And I'll go back to my colleague and friend who was in Puerto Rico and was discovering these bugs in the sidewalk, or another recent video that I came across of a person growing up outside of Philadelphia in very urban environment without a lot of resources, discovered butterflies in her neighborhood. So I think I guess what I'm trying to say is the curiosity about nature can be pursued in a lot of different contexts, which I think is really significant. And certainly, we don't want to make this somehow a conversation about I have to have so much extra time that I can experience curiosity. I think curiosity is an approach we take to life in general. And I realize it's going to have some different expressions given, where we live and, what kind of opportunities we have. But going back to your book, Elaine, I think what you've done so well is give these really key virtues that have a lot of expression in various ways. And so I think we can nurture curiosity in all kinds of different environments. I guess I'm trying to say in that, but we have to do it. We have to have intention with that, I think. And to the degree that I have resource churches in past grant projects, and also now through Science for the Church, we're giving churches tools to do that in a variety of contexts, and listening to churches that may not be traditional places for that, to say, what does curiosity look like, in an environment where you have two parents working, or a person, working two jobs as a parent. So we're trying to give resources to help with that. I think, again, the posture and virtue is curiosity, which is the bottom line.
You are. I know you have a weekly email list that I subscribe to and read in Science for the Church, and just really great information there for our listeners. I also am really struck by what you two have been, a thread of community that you two have been referring to, I think, throughout our conversation, and the way in which we as an individual parent don't need to know everything, that we're part of broader Christian communities. And I think that's so important to stress. Here's another question. I think this one is specifically for Greg. It says, the listener says, Greg, I enjoyed your article from the Zygon Journal about emerging adults, and I gave it to my honors science and religion seminar last semester. Thank you. What advice would you give about discussing these issues within public schools where a plurality of religious faiths and an increasing percentage of nuns?
Thanks. I love that question. Let me just say, if anybody wants to email me, I'd be happy to give you that article and send it to you on emerging adults on faith and science. The other element I would say is, now I teach at California State University Chico, which is the secular California State College university. So our context is pluralistic completely. And I teach a religion and science course at Chico State. In that, I've found a tremendous interest in how other religious traditions engage with science, Buddhism being one of the most fascinating for people. And I'll bring in a colleague like Daniel Weidlinger, who's a specialist in East Asian religions, talk about the connection, which is to say, I think what we do, whether it's a public school, maybe I'm not sure if it's high school or university, is to help bring in various voices. In that, I will say this, two interesting takeaways, and believe me, I could talk way too long about this because I think this is so fascinating. First of all, I almost always identify myself as a Christian. And in a pluralistic setting, actually people are fine with that. I think a lot of, you might have this happen to you, Elaine, a lot of people think there's a kind of hidden agenda that professors have, and they don't know what it is, but they want to keep finding it out. And I tell them, well, I go about this as a Christian. I go about this as a follower of Jesus Christ. But that means, because I have understood how Christians sometimes are misunderstood, I don't want to create that misunderstanding for anybody else. So if I talk about Buddhism and religion, and science, I want a Buddhist to be on my shoulder saying, yes, that's what I would say, or that represents Buddhism well. So that's the first thing, I think, is we can be out about that. And then secondly, small point is, just because there are many nuns doesn't mean they're not fascinated by this. And I think one of the surprising elements of the growth of the nuns, or the not religiously affiliating, is they are much more open, and they're less atheist with an attitude, I would say. One thing, they're not necessarily atheists, as Elaine, you know so well. But secondly, they're really open with people of faith, saying, this is how I look at things. So I think this, again, my Christian faith engagement with science flourishes in an environment in which there's an open conversation. And I love to be in conversation with people from other religious perspectives.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a fantastic answer. We're needing very sadly to draw to a close. We have about 70 questions which aren't answered, and that is merely because of time. And I really want to encourage the listeners to go ahead and email these folks. These are wonderful resources that we have before you today. I want to express my deepest thanks to Dr. Cootsona, to Dr. Reyes. It's just such a pleasure and honor to have you with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Elaine. It's really great to be part of this.